Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates. All I ask is that you think.
What's up, everybody? It's your boy Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates, and welcome to the Just My 3 Cents podcast, live rapid fire podcast where you can jump on with me. It is a late night start, later than usual. I was contemplating not getting this weekend because I've been so busy, but I didn't want to get too far away. I'm pretty sure a lot of you out there are hopefully tired of this. The situation. Unfortunately, had another shooting in Texas. The shooting in Buffalo, obviously, where the white supremacists allegedly, if you will, it was on camera, so fuck allegedly. So really, targeted African Americans. And I just happened to catch a couple of dialogues for those that are followers of the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, which you see behind me every Saturday morning, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you are a follower or listening to that show, then you may know the history of where we advocate to a degree, in a sense, not watching that type of stuff or getting too wrapped up in even tragedies like a Buffalo, even though it was obviously specifically targeting a race, but just being careful with the psychology and based on some of the historical trauma that, in a sense, a lot of African Americans, to a degree, collectively suffer from. We always try to be very careful, or at least recommend by having our therapists come on and talk about, in a sense, how much of those things should you consume, how much you should concern yourself with them. And so we're always real careful not to get into these situations too deeply, because there's a risk of trauma bonding, if you will, and escalating these situations even more in our own lives to the point where they can be, detrimental in our day-to-day lives. It's obviously unavoidable to a degree when these tragedies, such as, what happened in Buffalo with that particular shooter, if you will, clearly with some type of white supremacy ideology, if you will, leading the way for why he committed such a massacre. So to a degree, I definitely understand it can be unavoidable to a degree, but constantly with the help of our therapists, we're constantly saying on the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, if you can, don't consume too much of it. However, there was this running thought that always seems to come up during these situations. There's always the comparison. Once there's been something tragic, whatever the case may be, whether it be the Buffalo shooter, or a couple of years ago with the George Floyd situation. And so when these situations come up, there's always this inevitable comparison about what's happening in various African-American Black neighborhoods around the country, if you will. It always gets brought up at that time. And so I wanted to just walk through some context and some nuance that seems to always be missing when these comparisons are made. And the thing that when these comparisons are made, what's always being suggested, you're in the midst of this tragedy. So for me, for the life of me, I can't even really be honest why this comparison even comes up in these moments, if you will. I'm just being honest about that. It's just like, why would you, I literally just happened. I was telling you, I think it might have been last week, Just My 3 Cents, or on the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. I forget which one, but I was highlighting that I was listening to the radio maybe a day or two after the Buffalo shooting, and the radio station was bringing up this comparison. I'm just like, at the very moment, like this shit just happened, and here comes these narratives, right? And so I wanted to break down, make it make sense. That's what we do here. And again, if you're watching, you can also hit the link to join me at any time. Just want to put that out there just in case you're a first-time watcher. We are a live interactive podcast, so I'd like for you to participate more so than just listen to what I have to say. But I definitely wanted to, again, just address this one thing that in my opinion, and I think it would be hard to get away from this, there's context. One, the comparison gets made, and I wanted to show you how it doesn't make sense. And here's how. So you have the Buffalo shooting, right? And so the context when this comparison is made, what's being suggested is, do us as African Americans, do we really care about Black life, if you will, right? The Black Lives Matter. Do we care about Black life? If there's always seems to be this extra concern when there's a white person that's killed blacks, or typically when we're most upset, right? Most concerned is when the police may have shot someone or harmed somebody while in custody, or trying to get them in custody, whatever the case may be. There's just uproar. And this question, I saw this asked this week, and this is what made me decide. For those who have been longtime followers, I don't just jump on hot button items. That's not the goal here, unless I can provide a different perspective. And I hope, and there's people who already thought what I'm about to say, but it needs to be said more. And so the context is, hey, why is this uproar when this situation happens, but there's not the same uproar when there's black on black crime happening in the community? And what I heard said this week, and this is what made me want to do this particular conversation on Just My 3 Cent podcast, is why doesn't Black Lives Matter? Where are they at when these situations happen? So let's break down and make this make sense. So here's the context. So just to give a little backdrop to what Black Lives Matter, when they started, what they said they were about. And this is not about whether I'm with or agree with the organization or the move. That's definitely the organization, and then there's the movement, which people consider two different things. I think that's a fair comparison just to give context. But even in the actual organization that started, the focus was on injustice in reference to police interactions with African Americans, for those who've looked at the context of what they started about and what they're about. So they initially told you, in a sense, that was their overall concern amongst other things. So that's a completely different context than, in a sense, what's happening in the neighborhood. But here's the other part, because again, we're not talking about just the people that are in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? When that comparison is getting made, there's this idea that African Americans ourselves seemingly are not as concerned about Black lives when it's happening to us. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. It's the furthest thing from the truth. And here's the context. You don't have to believe me. Just listen to this. This is very simple. So what happens is, I'm fortunate enough. Here it is. Let's put this in context as well. The majority, let's get this clear, because when these comparisons are getting made, it's a broad, sweeping comment, when the reality is the majority of African Americans don't live in dangerous neighborhoods. The majority, like a far majority of African Americans don't live in dangerous neighborhoods. I wanted to throw that out there first and foremost, because even when we have this conversation, and while it is a generalization, in a sense, I've talked about this as well, when we take on the social construct of race as if something that doesn't even happen in your neighborhood, that somehow somebody in another neighborhood is representative of you. That's again a misnomer of how we psychologically receive the race construct, that you would even act like that person somehow represents you. And it's like, why are they doing that? And you don't even live in a place where this stuff happens. Again, the majority of the African American community is not in dangerous neighborhoods. Let's point that out first and foremost. But secondly, even in the neighborhoods where there unfortunately are, where there's high crime, where there is high murder rates, right? So even in those neighborhoods, there's never a time that somebody is actually not mourning or okay with a senseless murder. And even if the murder wasn't necessarily senseless, meaning that the two people involved lived the street life, if you will, and the situation came about in their world, which is a very limited part of the community, in their world, might have happened, quote unquote, for good reason. It never stops the whole community from being super upset and concerned and mourning somebody, because this is somebody's child that has lost their life, regardless of reason. And obviously, the community gets even more upset when if the street information is somebody, an innocent person, a senseless person, an unintended person, if you will, in one of those street situations, the whole neighborhood is up in roar. The whole neighborhood is up in roar and upset, and more, and especially when it's a innocent or senseless situation, you don't see anybody getting away with that murder because the neighborhoods making sure that that person goes to jail and they pay a price, which is a complete different context. When we let's start with police murders before we get to the Buffalo shooter, which is a completely different context than when there's a police shooting that has happened and the Black Lives Matter, and they say, where they at when black on black? Where they're showing up on the police situation because there is unfortunately a very long history where there was no accountability in the case often of police shootings, even when those police shootings were in error. There is this history of no accountability being held. And so, in a sense, the Black Lives Matter movement, who told you from the start their concern was, in a sense, for these type of situations, because to a degree, a police shooting that's unlawful in the event of those that are, for those that are unlawful, and there's a history in this country in which there was not always a punishment, then to a degree, you can technically call that a state-sponsored murder. And so you have a group that's saying, hey, in the 60s, in a sense, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement basically tried to hold the nation to its fire on providing us equal protection of the law. And if this type of situation where, in a sense, a state-sponsored murder is still an option, then you're not being held to the standard of equal protection to the law. So the uproar isn't simply that a white police officer, if you will, may have, they may have killed a black man. It ain't simply that. It's, is there going to be accountability? Now, here's, I'm always going to keep it a buck. Now, the reality within our community is that history is so true that our trauma and upsetness comes to the extent that sometimes it isn't always an unlawful shooting. However, based on history and based on our traumas, we naturally assume the worst in every situation. I'm just keeping it a buck. But again, that doesn't come from no place. That comes from a history for why we would. And what happens is there have been times where there should have been punishment and it did not happen. So the uproar isn't simply a white officer kills a black kid. It's, is this officer going to be held accountable? And the reality is, in the last few years, we've seen some accountability, and sometimes there are some examples where we feel like there hasn't been accountability. So that is still a concern in our community, but that is completely different context than, if you will, civilians having a situation and somebody ending up murdered and somebody goes to jail. So when you say, where is Black Lives Matter when there's black on black murder within the neighborhood, who they gonna show up to if somebody's already locked up for the situation? Or for those who are very aware of, in some of our high crime cities, there are, like Detroit, if you will, a lot of the murders are never solved, right? And so I like to speak to all the numbers. So there are some cities where the murders in those cities, like where I'm from, I'm a small town, and we've had unfortunately in my lifetime, 3 murders. They're all paid the price. So there's not like a situation where somebody's walking the street getting away with murder, because where I'm from is a rural place. You're not seeing a bunch of people get away with murder, right? But in these bigger cities where there are a lot of unsolved murders, in particular in some of the African American neighborhoods, as I've talked about this before on the show, unfortunately, that's amongst that 1% of the 1% who, in a sense, may be living by street rules and street laws, and they take care of their own situations themselves. I'm not agreeing with it, not on board with it whatsoever. But what it isn't is the rest of the neighborhood protecting these people. But when you have the context of a Buffalo shooter situation, right? When that's the context and somebody tries to bring up that a narrative, then you unfairly, the narrative of what about black on black murder is being brought up in the context that unfairly paints our culture as if we don't care. And that's absolutely not the case. Here's a perfect example of what I mean. So we just recently, right during the Biden administration, we just recently got to what this Asian Hate Act or whatever. And so when you think about that, and I don't know all the details to it or whatever, but some bill or something was passed in reference to Asian hate. And so on the internet, quite often, as that was happening, there was plenty of African Americans that sometimes could be, they've been upset about this, saying, "Hey, look how this happened real quick." In a sense, within the Asian community, where is this at for the African American community? So I bring up this example to show you that a bill got passed, in particular, because it seems like Asians were unfairly being targeted at a certain period of point, to where we always talk about the Asians. They don't even involve themselves in politics. Well, when things were happening within their culture, specifically for them, to a degree that they say, "Hey, we want to make notice of this," then you see that they quickly get involved in politics. So it's always, even just to throw that out, it's always been a misnomer that, in a sense, that they don't get involved. The reality is groups involve themselves in politics when it concerns them. And so it's a bad assumption that they don't get involved in politics, because clearly you see this bill pass. But I also want to highlight some more context to this bill passing. Another thing is, not only are they getting involved, but when we, like in our community, when we ask, well, why did that happen? Or even some people get upset about the fact that, if you will, Joe Biden moved to do something for the Asian, but quote unquote hasn't done nothing for the African American community. Well, when you understand that bills have to be written and passed, and that costs money, then you best believe whatever influence groups that they have in their community to influence the lobbyists and say, "Hey, you got my vote in the future," is how you see a bill getting passed. Because at the end of the day, a politician only functions with you heavy if you got some money to go behind it, or you are an influencer that can bring them a lot of votes. So when you see this thing passing or whatever, I hate that sometimes we put it in the context of it looking like, because I get it, on the optics, it looks like America cares less about African Americans, and maybe because this bill passed relatively so quickly, it looks like they may care more about Asian Americans. When it's just, I'm talking about for those who see it from that purview, the reality is, for those that see it from that purview, you're just not understanding the game of politics. There's a lot of money written behind, being supported behind that bill for whatever that's in the bill. Somebody had to write that and get paid to write that. You best believe those, in a sense, Asian groups, that political groups that wanted this passed, put that money up. So it ain't a situation of America caring about one group or the others. They just played the political game. But here's the context specifically for tonight's discussion, the context that I'm trying to provide here. The specific part is, so while there's anywhere on average about 15,000 murders a year in the country, if you will, just on average. And so the unfortunate reality of most murders that are happening, let's put the gangs aside, because that's a small, can be a small percentage. It could be I'm gonna say a small percentage of the murders. It's again, they're playing their own rules or whatever, and they don't always play by them. But unfortunately, I'm going to step that aside. For the rest of the murders, quite often, if it's not the normal personal conflict, or unfortunately domestic violence leads to a lot of murders and things of that nature, which is a kind of a person to person, some type of transgression happened that escalated to the point where somebody got murdered, right? And so we got those murders, again, usually senseless, don't make sense, even when they escalate to what they escalate to. Again, not okay with murders. Let's just make that very clear. But again, when you go look into those situations, there was some type of somebody at least thought they was transgressed upon, and it led or escalated to violence to that degree. And then everything else may be robberies that end up, again, the person robbing probably didn't intend to murder, but the situation escalated to the point where they murdered, or a burglary that ends up, turning into a murder. So you have all these situations where some criminal or somebody basically flies off the handles and murders somebody, again, the gang situations aside. So when those situations are happening, for the most part, there'll be everybody in the neighborhood. If it happened in your neighborhood, know about it, then there's the typical investigation, and somebody hopefully pays the price. But there is basically a reason, not maybe a good reason, but there's a reason why the murder happened for a criminal that was robbing, but hopefully, they probably do a bunch of robberies, but don't kill people. But a situation led to a murder, right? So obviously, you needing to rob or deciding to rob was probably is not probably it is a messed up reason, but the context happens within that crime, and the criminal is, in a sense, looking to gain something, and a murder end up happening. That's most situations when there's intentional crime being committed, and then the other situations where one-on-one escalates into a situation where somebody ends up murdering someone. It could happen on the spot. It could brew over a few weeks, and somebody ends up doing it for whatever reason, over jealousy, over envy, all kind of crazy reasons why somebody might murder someone. However, it ain't like Asians don't get murdered in this country. Not a large percentage of this population, right? So it's not like none of them get murdered. Again, they're not a lot because they're not a big percentage, 5% of the population, if you will, right? So, but they decided to do this Asian hate bill. Why? Let's put this type of harm or murder in context compared to every other situation I said. You got the gang and street stuff. They have kind of their own stupid rules that they follow where they think it's okay to murder. You got the situation I just said, individual escalates, or you have a criminal committing a crime that turns into a murder with something to gain. What happens when you have a situation where, oh, this only happened because of my race, because of my ethnicity? This is the only reason. So, because if somebody harms, and for example, using the Asian example, harms an Asian simply because they're Asian, for whatever been put in their head, whatever been fed in their head, to the point where they're going to go harm someone simply because they're an Asian, that's the one that makes the least sense. Again, all murders are not okay, but the Asians in that situation says, well, if the only reason you're doing it, what do you have to gain other than the fact that you hate this Asian? And so their community said, okay, as much as we say they're not involved in politics, got heavily involved to say, you know what, we want some extra punishment put on a situation if it's determined that the only reason this is happening is for no other reason, because this person has nothing to gain. They're actually all acting off of hate. So when you put context or even try to weigh out murders, it becomes the most senseless of them all. And so the agent says, we want more punishment. If that, again, no agent is gonna say I'm okay with a store owner, if you will, being shot in a burglary. They're not okay with that. But we have laws and things in place. If they catch that person, that they'll go to jail for. But they're saying, well, hold on, we don't want it to be like, again, nobody's okay with the burglar, nobody's okay with the robber. But what they're least okay with, I'm talking about just putting in the context of them, what they're least okay with is the situation in which it's only been done simply because that could just be as random as hell, and this person has nothing to gain. So we want extra punishment on this type of murder if we can prove that. So you get the Asian hate bill. We have hate crimes have been on our law books for various states and federal laws. There have been hate crimes have been around for a long time. It's just the context that of all the different murders we have, if it is proven that you've moved in hatred, we're going to give you extra time. You can't change what's going on in someone's heart, but the idea is when these situations happen, if there's extra time, or a significant amount of extra time, that context can bleed into society to the point where it's making someone who may be harboring that type of hatred in their heart, in a sense, being aware there's going to be more crime if there's no other reason for you doing this besides the color of somebody's skin. And so if what I'm saying now, it makes a whole bunch of sense why you're going to see this uproar. And then what happens is, like, if that uproar makes sense for Asians, it makes sense for them. Instead of all the different Asians that may get murdered throughout their time in America, they've never asked for a hate bill, that they asked for this one because it becomes senseless. That's the same thing that happens with black and white and black on black. So what happens is this situation with this shooter, is for those that know, I'll never say their name. I never want to give them any infamy, because that's part of the reason they even get to this point and are willing to go as far as becoming a mass shooter. I've always said I wish the media would do a media blackout on the name of any mass shooter. I know that may sound crazy because that's not, we do the opposite, we overcover. But I'm just saying, at the end of the day, when these fools get to the point where they're willing to go this far, part of what they're chasing is to go down in infamy. And I would love if the media would just black out their names completely so that they don't get the satisfaction of the infamy. And I think it will play a small role in cutting down on some of these situations, because especially for somebody saying, okay, their life is down in the drain and they're ready to go ahead and take their life out, but part of their thing is to go down in infamy. And I would love for that to be taken out of the context. So I make it a rule to never say these suckers' names in no mass shooting situation. So again, in the Buffalo situation, I'm just literally breaking down that the Asians actually got involved in politics to create an Asian hate bill because of all the ways that they might get murdered. That makes the least sense. So it's absolutely natural to say, of all the different murders that happened, the one that makes the least sense was because of some ideology, and there's nothing to gain whatsoever. Again, it's, a lot of people go to jail and end up as Wallow and them say all the time on $1 Million Game. You were in jail for something you did within 5 minutes if they shot or murdered somebody during a robbery, if you will. That wasn't necessarily the robber's intention. They just wanted to scare the person and get the money, leads to a murder or whatever. It's stupid and it's senseless. And a lot of times it ain't even enough money worth doing 13 years for, doing 20 years for, doing 30 years for, right? So it ends up being silly in its actual context. However, it is being done with something to gain. These situations that are simply over race naturally are the most senseless, to the point where Asians got involved in the politics and tried to create them a bill. So it absolutely makes sense that the media is going to cover, oh wow, this was just done for no other reason than that. And so what happens is the media starts to coverage, and somehow their extra coverage, because they want eyes and want to make their money too, their extra coverage of a race situation somehow gets put on the context of our community with these BS narratives, as if we care less. The media wants to make its money too. And so what happens is, out of 10 to 15,000 murders in the year, most of them are not going to make the news regardless of who did it. That's just simply a reality. And if it makes sense, so it ain't that we have more concern when a white person kills us, because it's no different than Asians saying, I want a hate bill when we find out somebody's murdering us or harming us strictly for our race. Of all the laws that are already on the book, we want to put notice that there's a penalty for doing it for no other reason. If that context makes sense, then it makes sense why our community is upset when you find out there's no other reason than race. That's simple as that. But don't tell me there's not a community mourning every time there is a black on, quote unquote, black on black murder in those towns. I've already done plenty of shows breaking down how that's literally a political narrative that's complete BS. People are not more concerned. People literally think that our community is okay with murderers and killers walking around. Gang members are, street gangs are, but the rest of the community cannot stand that. Not okay with it, and don't let it be. So that's what I wanted to bring y'all tonight. Nobody jumped on with me. Was hoping to get some 3 cents, but I know this was a late night. People will probably sleep. But I just wanted to, hopefully I made sense that if it makes sense that, again, there's been plenty of laws already on the book. And again, I'm just using that example to say that community itself doesn't necessarily care more about somebody outside their race killing them than when there's been other murders, if you will, of Asians. It's just, this makes the least sense. It's the most senseless. What is there to gain for the actual perpetrator? So since there's nothing to gain for the perpetrator, they wanted a bill to stress that. So it is very natural for us as African Americans when you find out that somebody, in a sense, murdered simply for race or whatever. And so humans, unfortunately, murder's never going to go away, if you will, or in American culture, if you will, not making it okay. However, to act like there's more emphasis and people are mourning less when there's a black on black, there's a murder that happens in the neighborhood is complete BS. The media covers this type of situation, and then of course when you get into the Buffalo shooter situation, there's the context of look what his social media showed. Could we have figured out who he was? And let me give one last context on that, and then I'm gonna finish this show. One context on that. Matter of fact, I think it was the last Just My 3 Cent show. It might have been last Mental Dialogue show, but even one of my Queens of Intellect members, mentioned this idea of getting like white people getting their handle on their mass shooters, and she was thinking about the Buffalo shooter, if you will. And again, getting into the idea, go back and watch my show on social construct. When you go back and understand the social construct of race, it's not even an idea of white people getting a handle on a mass shooter. At the end of the day, these mass shootings, if it was something that our country, in an open country like ours, could easily stop, you best believe law enforcement and the government would stop it if it was as simple as that. Of course, I know people can get into the arguments of gun control and that kind of stuff. I'm not having that discussion in this moment. I'm just highlighting the idea of racial construct makes us put it in. White people need to get a handle on it. Like at the end of the day, stopping a mass shooter, whether it be the Buffalo shooter or the situation in Texas, I promise you, law enforcement would love to, in a sense, not to stop it either way. And for them, that ain't even about race. It's just about, can we stop mass shootings for whatever reason that these people are going through mental health situations and are deciding we're going to go kill a whole bunch of people before I go out. So that's a mental health. We get frustrated when it gets put in the context of mental health, because we know quite often that context is not provided to African Americans when, in a sense, they've done something, whatever that might be, especially when it comes to murder. And so I'm not saying it's okay that context isn't applied to African Americans. That's not what I'm saying. However, we get upset from the standpoint of the context should be applied to African Americans, and we're mad that the context is applied in these situations that somebody gets to that point. And I'm saying that at the end of the day, law enforcement and government wants to stop these mass shooters, and if they've shown the inability to be able to do so, regardless of who these mass shooters go out, because like the situation in Buffalo obviously affects the African American community, so we're concerned. But let's be honest and real about most of these mass shootings. Most of them, in a sense, in the past have not necessarily been racially motivated, and so these mass shooters go take out whoever they can take out, whatever, for whatever their crazy reasons are. And at the end of the day, the only context is law enforcement and the government doing the best job they can to stop it. If you feel like it's not a good job, I can respect that. I'm not saying it's a good or bad job. I'm just trying to show you the context is basically race shouldn't be applied to crime in a negative context toward us, nor should we put the stopping of crime in the context of race, when at the end of the day, stopping mass shooters is just a job of law enforcement, not white people or black people. It's just a job of law enforcement. I hope that makes sense. Again, I just want to throw that last context on this discussion. Again, that's the goal, is to try to make it make sense, add some context. Oh, I got some comments. Let me see what let's read these comments real quick. Code word, kill. Money and vote. Oh, yeah, you like that. Money and votes. Let's see here. Let me see if I can see this other comment. Code word, kill. I don't understand that comment. Oh, not that one. Let me do this last one. From William. Nobody wanted to jump on me. Yeah, money and votes for sure. That's how you get an Asian hate bill passed. Got nothing to do with like we sometimes not so much. People don't emotionally think that things happen within politics based on right and wrong. It's just not how the game's played. So, yeah, definitely. Thank you for understanding that, William. I think that's my last thought with it. I hope nobody jumped on with me tonight, but I know it's late. People are probably in bed. Hopefully this made sense. Let me know if I need to share this with more people. Hopefully y'all will also subscribe to the page and share with other people. I had a late night. I don't know. I usually share something from my upcoming book, Re-Education of the Negro. Working very hard on that. Changed the name. The book was called Just My 3 Cents: Hard Conversations on Race, Sex, and Culture. But now I'm changing it to Re-Education of the Negro. And quite often I will end the show with the piece from my book. Let me see if I got a piece pulled up. I'm just going to share a random piece tonight. A lot of times I'll try to share a piece that's related to the conversation. But this one, I'm just going to just find a piece real quick and read it and close out the show. So again, from the upcoming book, Re-Education of the Negro, this piece is Black Socrates Speaks, The Browning of America. Is America designed to hold African Americans down? At the heart of America, people would like to believe no, but when answering this question, we typically skirt around the truth in order to be politically correct. I always say political correctness is going to be the death of our free society as we know it. At the core of our free society is freedom of speech and of our inalienable rights. We see its importance by the fact our founding fathers placed it first in the Bill of Rights. The right to dissent propelled our country from its hypocritical history of limited rights for only a select few to the motto of freedom for the world to admire. In our vast melting pot, as truly a land of immigrants, the Liberty Bell rings loudly, but for many African Americans, the crack is still there. Therefore, it rings cautiously. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925 that required government contractors take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. This was the birth of affirmative action, and since that time, it has gone through several transformations in America's courtroom. Currently, we are awaiting. Oh, I forgot to tell y'all, this was written back in, I'll give you that context, I'm sorry, written back in 2016. So when you hear this, it's not current, actually. Forgot to say that. Currently, we are awaiting the Supreme Court's decision in Fisher versus University of Texas, the most recent case in the long saga of affirmative action cases. Oral arguments were heard on October 10th, 2016, and based on the court's makeup, they are expected to rule against affirmative action in college admissions. If this is the case, this would effectively be the death of affirmative action after 51 years of existence. The decision will be based on the politically correct buzzword of fairness, despite the unfairness of minority students disproportionately graduating from high schools known as dropout factories. There are those who tout voucher programs, but vouchers absolutely do nothing to address the failing schools itself. The commonalities in all of these failing schools are large minority populations. Now imagine if boys and girls had to go to separate schools for their entire primary education, including high school, but most of the girls were stuck in dropout factories. There wouldn't be a Supreme Court case brought forward addressing fairness in college admissions without addressing the unfair starting point of the young ladies trapped in these dropout factories. There are studies that show once minority students are placed into higher education, they significantly close the achievement gap in their 4 years of college. Although a recent study conducted at Duke University attempted to disprove this theory by stating minorities avoid the harder majors to close the gap. This study was also sent to the Supreme Court and archived as information even before the court decided to hear Fisher versus University of Texas. Hear the Fisher of University Texas case. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but how convenient. Why wouldn't I look at this concerted effort to protect a privileged position but disguised under fairness? No one ever discusses, for example, the biggest trump card on any college application more so than race, religion, extracurricular activities, etc., and that's children of alumni. Outside of historically black colleges and universities, what's the likelihood of those students being minorities? Therefore, students of alumni inherently are a protected benefit of the majority, and the browning of America only scares those who have systemically had a stranglehold on privilege thus far. Hopefully, the Supreme Court pays attention to the 50 major corporations, including America Express, Pfizer, Walmart, and Kraft Foods, who recently came out with a unified brief in support of affirmative action for college admissions. Just my 3 cents. All I ask is that you think. Sidebar: the Supreme Court actually upheld the University of Texas use of affirmative action in a 4-3 decision. So I wrote the piece and I had to do the sidebar because I predicted based on the makeup of the court that they were going to strike it down. They end up upholding it back in 2016. So I just had to give that sidebar. But again, the idea for these pieces in the Re-Education of the Negro book is to have dialogue that to read these commentaries, share them with others, and have hard conversations on race, sex, and culture. So I'll end the night there. Let's make sure nobody jumped on here at the last minute with me. All right, cool. Make sure there's no more comments. All right, we good to go. See y'all next Wednesday. Hopefully, I'll be able to come in on time. It's not so late. And hopefully y'all will jump in with me, because I usually get people to take me on when I jump on earlier. That's the goal, for y'all to interact with me, not just hear me monologue for now 40 minutes. Y'all have heard me monologue. So hope I made it make sense. Please share this with others if you heard something that makes sense. I hope people learn to avoid the context of the community caring more about when a white person kills us than when a black person kills us. It's foolish. It's foolish. It's just the senselessness of it being done with nothing to gain for the murderer. And so people naturally are more upset, just like the Asians got more upset when crime seemingly started happening to them when they recently during the pandemic. And they got more upset and took a political step to say, hey, we want to put extra time if somebody does it for this reason, in addition to what already can happen to somebody that murders somebody for various reasons. So it just makes sense, but it's not more of a concern or less concern when it happens to your own. It's the senselessness of why the murder happened that created this conversation. So since that makes sense, don't let anybody foolishly get you in the context of, well, what about us? When you're saying that, you don't know a murderer that's walking around. There's 99.9% of the African American community will never be involved in a murder. That's not a made up number. That's a reality. So don't let somebody foolishly bring in some context when it actually makes sense why there is concern, or why the media covers it. And when the media covers it, that doesn't mean we're more concerned as African Americans. It's just the media coverage may make it appear that way, but it's not more concern. We're upset about everybody that dies in our community, and the only people who are not are the 1% of the 1% that play the street game, and they've, in their minds, normalized murder. That's not something that's normalized in our community. So don't fall for that foolishness anymore. That's my 3 cents. See y'all next week. All right.